Hello and welcome. I'm Shelby Magid, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for our event today, War and Peace, the State of the Battlefield and Trump's Diplomacy in Ukraine. There certainly is a lot to discuss, as it's been a very hectic few weeks with a lot of developments. And I'd like to note that this conversation comes at a sobering moment, as next week marks 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, though the war truly began 11 years ago. The Ukrainian people and the armed forces continue to bravely defend their country against an unprovoked war of aggression, while also weighing the prospects of diplomatic efforts. So to unpack this pivotal moment, we have an outstanding panel of experts who will share their insights and analysis. Thank you to our panel for joining. It's my pleasure to introduce you. We've got Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine. Minister Andrei Zahornyuk, Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and Chairman of Center for Defense Strategies, and also former Minister of Defense of Ukraine. And last but not least, James Scher, OBE, Honorary Fellow at the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, and Associate Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. We're going to begin with our panel, and then we'll move to audience questions. You can submit your questions at askac.org, and I'll pitch them to the panel. And again, that is askac.org. So Ambassador Herbst, we will begin with you. The Trump administration concluded initial talks with Russia over the war in Ukraine on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia. What was discussed during these talks, and how should we interpret the fact that the Ukrainian government was not included in the talks? How might that impact the feasibility of a future outcome that all parties, including Ukraine, agree to?
What we know from the readout from the public discussion of those talks, besides discussing ending Moscow's aggression against Ukraine, they talked about bulking up the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and the Russian Embassy in Washington. They talked about possible economic cooperation in the future, although Secretary of State Rubio said that's contingent upon getting the war done, ending the war. And they also talked about other forms of U.S.-Russian cooperation. The administration has been roundly criticized for such an agenda while Moscow is waging the savage war against Ukraine. And I think that criticism is just. Some people claim, with good reason, that this looks like a Trump reset of the relationship with Russia. And we know that Obama tried a reset, didn't go very well. Biden, without calling it a reset, tried a reset, which did not go very well. So why in the world is Trump trying a reset? This has fueled concern amongst, I'd say, most commentators Western commentators on the war in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine from Russia, that the Trump team may be willing to bow to Putin's preferences as opposed to establish a durable peace, which is the stated aim of the administration. I think that the Trump team still wants to establish a stable, durable peace. And if I'm right, and the evidence points in both directions, then doing this event that way was a serious mistake, because the Russians think that Trump is bending to Putin's will. And the only way you get to a durable peace is to make clear to Russia that there'll be a very heavy price for them to pay if they don't move in that direction. And so this sent the wrong signals.
Thank you very much. Minister, let's turn to you for your interpretation. How significant was Kyiv's exclusion from the meeting? And unmute yourself.
Well, there's been a traditional principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That's clearly not the case anymore. As such, we as a independent analytical community, we cannot agree with that approach that it's correct. At the same time, we understand that there is a desire to start the negotiations from the sort of fresh start. But the way it started, as Ambassador Herbst just mentioned, it already sent some wrong signals. So certainly we are concerned. I'm not speaking on behalf of Ukraine government in any way, just to make sure. And certainly we have serious questions and concerns whether the negotiations generally has any chance for succeeding. Why? Because we don't see any indications from Russia that they have changed their strategy. That would be very surprising to see, but we don't see that in any case. And as such, the agreement certainly will not have something which Russia doesn't want to sign. And Russia will not want to sign a lot of things which need to happen. For example, Ukraine needs to ensure that Russia cannot strike again. So there needs to be some serious deterrence package, which we probably will discuss later today. Certainly, we need to talk about the responsibility. We cannot just leave it without responsibility, without criminal responsibility, and so on. Certainly, Russia will not agree on all that. So it's a very, very, very dangerous path we're on right now. And certainly, there must be some solution. But at the same time, it's very easy to make a mistake. So I sincerely hope that we will be, well, kind of hope cannot be, in this case, a strategy, but in any case, we need to work on the fact that Ukraine is heard and common sense is heard. And common sense tells us that Russians are very devious negotiators. They will try to manipulate. And some simple solution will not work by just definition. Because for somebody, it could be just, let's just stop the war. And that ceasefire, that cessation of hostilities can be seen as a great result. And for sure, any cessation of hostilities might be a great result because people don't die. We need to think about that, first of all, of course. But some people on the other side may consider this as an operational pause, a part of military maneuver, which they will use in order to prepare the forces, reconstitute, replenish, and so on and so on. If we don't think about those consequences, that can turn into disaster. And that's the key thing which we need to look at all the time.
Thank you very much. James, what's the general sentiment in Europe surrounding the Trump administration's approach to the negotiations with Russia? And is there widespread agreement among European nations here? And you also need to unmute.
Let me put this in the broadest possible perspective. For over 100 years across Europe and in much of the world, the United States has been seen as a force for good in the world, and the international order has been seen to be underpinned by US power, both hard and soft. Those certainties have been rudely unsettled in the past few weeks across Europe, and it has been the impact has been of what we have heard has been breathtaking. I am not relying on commentators. I am relying on well-placed and senior officials, admittedly, most of them talking slightly off camera, not always. They are not only stunned by the pace and the radical nature of what has been discussed, of apparent agreements, of the commonality of language, in many cases, between the United States and Russia, but they are equally stunned by the fact that all of this has come without any kind of warning. It is however Washington might perceive it. From a European perspective, most of this has come as a complete surprise, out of the blue. And I would say a lot of Europeans are equally stunned by the absence of any strong vocal opposition in the United States, particularly in Congress, from either party. So I would add to this that, in part because of what I have said, many are coming to the conclusion that the problem is not just Donald Trump and his most ideological supporters, but the fact that, of course, half of the US polity elected Donald Trump. Biden, when he came to office in 2020, described Trump and the first Trump presidency as an anomaly. He has not only returned, but he has returned and is pursuing a policy that is totally without the fetters and constraints that existed in his first term. And so many are concluding here that the United States is the problem, and in the long term, there is no alternative to Europe being able to construct as much autonomy as can be constructed to be able to defend its most critical interests. I would not, if you are sitting in the United States, I would not underestimate the breadth and the magnitude and the depth of this anxiety and these sentiments in Europe.
Thank you for that. I am sitting in the United States, and while Ambassador Herbst is traveling, I would still like to tap him in for a Washington perspective. Ambassador Herbst, is there any reaction you have to that? And is there truly no vocal opposition that we're seeing from the Hill or elsewhere in Washington?
Okay, I am now in Warsaw, and before that in Brussels, before that in London, before that in Munich. So I think I may have heard from a fair number of the same relatively senior officials that James has heard from, the concerns. And I think those concerns are understandable. And I think that Europe moving itself in a way that it can protect itself better would be very good, but also for American interests. I think that James is partly right regarding the pushback in the United States to President Trump and his agenda. I say partly right because we've seen, I think, some significant steps, although probably not broad enough for James' taste, and I understand that. Two newspapers that have been, at least whose editorial boards have been staunchly pro-Trump for years, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Post, have written acerbic criticisms, no hold bars, of Trump's actions and statements over the past 9 or 10 days. Equally important, at this point, at least a dozen, maybe more, lawmakers, Republican lawmakers, have not directly criticized Trump, but have pointed out that many things said by Trump are factually incorrect. That is not a good look for the President of the United States. So there has been some pushback, but I would agree more is warranted, more is needed. And I would also add that one reason that we haven't seen more is that you have a new president in office, right? He's now been in office about 1 month. It's true every time you have a new administration. They behave with a fair amount of arrogance, as if the political wind is at their back. And both members of their party who have an imperative to support the new president and members of the opposition who are still off balance from having lost the presidential election have not coalesced to a point where they can effectively mobilize against the new president. But that will change with time, especially as some of the initiatives of the new administration, whether or not they directly relate to foreign policy or to this issue, prove to be unpopular. But I am encouraged by those dozen Republican lawmakers and the two, again, strongly pro-Trump newspapers calling a spade a spade. And it's not just them who've done that. We've seen others in conservative media do the same thing.
Great, thank you. Minister Zakharnyuk, let's turn over to the battlefield. So Russia is grinding forward at great cost, but with fewer results in the past few weeks. For example, there's been a noticeable slowdown in Donbass, alongside reports that Russia's stockpiles of tanks and armored vehicles are experiencing significant shortages. Are these reports correct? And how much longer will Russia be able to keep up the pace of attrition? Is the Kremlin adjusting its fighting strategy to compensate for this?
Yes, these reports are correct. We also see, again, I would remind that we publish daily frontline newsletter free of charge in Substack called CDS Daily Briefing. But the thing is that, yes, we do see this slowdown, absolutely. And it's very significant. The key thing is that it's not even how long Russia can sustain that pace. The key question is that their war-fighting concept stopped working, because we have seen in 2024 that they have adopted this attritional human wave very Whoever is a military historian, they know that from Iran-Iraq War, 1980-1988, very Iranian kind of tactic. So with human waves, with trench warfare, with a lot of similarities. But the thing is that at this time, it stopped even delivering even modest results. So the results which are, let's put it this way, 2024, everybody were saying that this was the most successful year for Russia. According to the open sources which are widely available, they have taken 4,100 kilometers of Ukrainian territory. For sure, for us, it's a problem because these are our villages and these are our towns where our people live and so on and so on. But just to put things in perspective, if you draw a circle of with that area, the diameter of that circle will be like 45 miles. So we're not talking about like a vast territories, a vast destruction of Ukrainian territory. This is the you know, this is the area, this is our area, this is our pain, but that's not the end of Ukraine at all. And essentially we are in a situation when Russia now are slowed down even compared to that perspective. Most of those acquisitions or like occupation, if I may say, happened in the autumn time, so during the autumn offensive, and clearly it has slowed down. What Russia can sustain in that pace, like today, probably for months and months right now. But the question is what for? Because after a certain period of time, it will look like losing, not like winning. And I have to say that I was part of the whole number of papers which published by Western analysts by the end of the last year. And in many of the, and in not in all of them, I'm a co-author. I was just like reviewing them, you know, like they asked. And every second time I was like, you know, drawing out the statement that Ukraine is slowly losing the war. And lots of those like gone. I mean, these phrases are gone because Ukraine wasn't losing the war. Ukraine was certainly having a trouble with the war, and it still does. But losing is a very ambiguous term and extremely inaccurate. But the thing is that Russia is certainly not winning the war. So first of all, the statement which we hear sometimes today that Ukraine has to take any deal because it's doing extremely bad, it's a wrong statement. Let's put it this way. And secondly, Russia's approach to the war, Russia's concept of war fighting, which it found somehow acceptable last year, is no longer working. So they do need to rethink how they're going to fight now. I'm sure they're rethinking it as we speak. But most certainly, they may not come up with the new solutions, which would be game changers. And in this case, they will be stuck. And in this case, after a couple months, unless Ukraine even if Ukraine doesn't do any breakthroughs, which it can in some areas, unfortunately, that requires resources, and they are still under the question. But even if Ukraine doesn't do breakthroughs, in some period of time, it will be clear that Russia is stuck. So that's a situation where we are right now.
Thank you very much. And we've got some questions coming in on our askac.org that seem like they want to get your military knowledge. So as a reminder, you can take advantage of our panelists and submit your questions there. And now, Ambassador Herbst, off the battlefront and back to President Trump. So President Trump came into office saying that he would end the war in 6 months and initially described Putin as the obstacle to peace. In Riyadh, the agenda was broader and included the normalization of U.S.-Russia relations. How do you think this could impact the peace process?
Well, there's no question that this is not a shrewd tactic if you're trying to get Moscow to agree to terms to establish a stable peace. But Andrei is right, the minister is right, that that's not Putin's objective. Putin's objective is to establish effective Russian control over Ukraine. That can be done by having a puppet government in Kyiv. It can be done by taking a good bit more of basically all of Ukraine to the east of the Dnipro River, but then also south to Moldova, leaving Ukraine as a rump landlocked state. It's not to achieve a stable or durable peace that enables Russia to continue occupying the parts of Ukraine it currently occupies. If the Trump team understands that, they know the only clear way to move Putin in the right direction is to demonstrate that he will pay an enormous price for continuing to pursue this savage war. That means, as Trump talked about himself and his team has talked about, major additional economic pressure on Ukraine. And as Vice President J.D. Vance mentioned in that Wall Street Journal interview just 9 days ago, perhaps military means. And as Trump himself said amidst those provocative statements, that we have to continue arming Ukraine, continuing aiding Ukraine, because otherwise Putin will try to go farther. So again, if this is Trump's objective to achieve that peace, doing an event which seems to be a reset, which doesn't focus laser-like on the war, is a tactical error. But I think there's a reason for that tactical error, which is based upon Trump's own personality and his own record. He has a track record of using bombast against American allies, whether it was Angela Merkel in the first term, Justin Trudeau today, the leaders of Denmark today. But his approach to the dictators of countries with substantial military power may involve an occasional barb, but more often involves flattery. That's how he dealt with Kim Jong-un in the first term, and we're seeing the same play now with Putin. Why Trump does that, I can't explain. It didn't work with Kim Jong-un, and Trump walked away from the negotiation because he realized he could not get the deal he wanted. For those of us who dealt with the Soviet Union and Russia for 40 or 50 years, and then, James, that's you and me and others, we know that that's not the way to move an aggressive Kremlin. But, Trump, he did win the presidential election, so he gets to call the tactics. But I think he's cutting against his own interest. Again, if his interest remains to achieve in quick time a durable peace.
Thank you very much. James, if you want to respond to that, you are welcome to, but I've also got another question. So with no immediate role for European leaders in international talks to end the war, European leaders convened on Monday for a discussion of their own in Paris to discuss European contributions to the Ukrainian peace process, following calls from the Trump administration to do so. Ideas making headlines have included the institution of possible European peacekeeping troops on Ukrainian soil following the conclusion of a lasting peace agreement, to which Trump responded positively. What specific support would Europe need from the US for this critical but perilous mission? And unmute.
Thanks, Shelby. Very briefly, in response to John, I agree at this time, I think with 85–90% of what he said. All that I would add is that Donald Trump, like Vladimir Putin, only respects those who are strong. He only respects great powers, preferably with autocratic, strong leaders. And I think what has emerged and what has sunk through in Europe is that he does not regard Europe as an equal. He does not respect Europe. He doesn't even take Europe seriously as a potential source of opposition to him. And this is part of his nature, but it also then becomes a factor in US policy and the reaction to US policy. Now, in response to your question, this is a maddening set of questions because this whole issue of a European military role in Ukraine is from beginning to end dogged with imprecision. What exactly are people talking about? A peacekeeping force on a border like that, which would require a number of troops way beyond what Europe has available? Are we talking about that? Are we talking about a deterrent force? Or are we talking about a European tripwire? And if a European tripwire or a deterrent, leading to what? And as a result of this imprecision, we have people all over Europe disagreeing with one another who might not disagree because they can't fundamentally define what it is they are talking about. So this is why this is such a maddening question. And I would say, out of realism, the following. If a country is thinking of putting troops on the ground in Ukraine, they have to understand this. If you are not prepared to fight, don't go. It's not just Washington, it's NATO headquarters that have said there will not be, this will not be seen as a NATO mission, and you cannot count on a collective NATO response if you get yourselves into trouble. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say, not to speak terribly long, is that many are still talking, and this is another area of imprecision, as if the emergence of a European peacekeeping force is to come out of an agreement with Russia. Well, this is impossible by definition. Russia might accept a European force in Ukraine if it's forced to accept it, but Russia is never going to agree to it unless they have a veto role in determining what that force can and cannot do, as they did in the Minsk process. And it is interesting in his speech at Munich that Secretary Hegseth said that we are not going to repeat Minsk, but then they spoke about, people have spoken about a peacekeeping force in exactly the terms of Minsk, which give Russia a veto over what that force is and how it is used. So we have to make a very clear and basic distinction. It's always been there. There is a lot that Russia will accept if they have to, but Russia is not going to agree to anything that we can conceivably accept if they don't have to. I think I've said enough. Thanks, Shelby.
Thank you. Minister Zahranuk, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, of course. Well, to expect that we build up the agreement with Russia, where part of this agreement would be deterring Russia, is just absurd by definition. Indeed, I mean, it's just like Russia is a harasser. You know, its ruler is probably the greatest living criminal on earth right now, and he accepts it because he's not even hiding his crimes. And we're going to be talking about how to deter future lapses of that war, and they should accept that. That just doesn't make sense. So, I mean, without the deterrence, this whole thing is not going to hold 4 or 5 minutes. We have seen this enough. If Russia will see that as a ceasefire without any guarantees from our side that they cannot, because it's in a military terminology is called deterrence by denial. So basically, it's like building a force which will ensure that any future campaign is failed, and making that force so visible to the adversary that they understand that they comprehend the the consequences, and those consequences working, that understanding of the consequences working as deterrent. So that basically keeps them away from future campaigns. So it's not just has to be like some assurances from Europe or whoever else. It should be so evident to Putin that if he tries again, he miserably fails. And that information needs to be absolutely crisp and clear. And only then we will have a deterrent effect. Potentially, not necessarily, but maybe we'll have a deterrent effect. If we don't do that, we don't have a deterrent effect. And that's basically an invitation for the next campaign. That basically says Ukraine will demobilize, Ukraine will let the people go from the front, reduces the army to its financial ability, or transforms it into the standing army / reserve, etc., etc. Europe will sleep again. United States, I don't know what the US policy will be. Europe will be supplying maybe some weapons, time after time, not necessarily newest one, not necessarily competitive one, and so on and so on. And after that, they can plan a new campaign. And taking into account that they have their strategic goals intact right now, Russians, they certainly will be planning new campaign, because he wants to look strong in front of their own people and in front of their own elites. If he avoids the responsibility, like criminal responsibility, for massive financial responsibility after that, then it's basically even it could be presented as a good result, and they can go for the next campaign. We should not forget that right now half of Russian economy is working for the war. They cannot demobilize economy that quickly. They cannot just say people, okay, guys, now go and make, I don't know, whatever, tables and chairs in your factories. It's just not happening like that. They will have to keep on making weapons. They have to restore their lost warehouses. They have to build reserves. They have to build a surplus of the ammunition and parts and so on and so on. And after that, they will say, okay, what we're going to do with that? Maybe let's start again. So that, yeah, this is something which people currently working on. Very difficult topic. We're part of that process, our organization, and but there's lots of questions which are currently not answered.
Thank you very much. And then briefly, I want to touch on the ongoing fighting. We've seen Ukrainian drones and missiles can strike deep inside Russia when aimed at targets such as military depots and oil refineries. How is Ukraine's ability to strike deep inside Russia impacting the situation right now?
The effect of those operations is very complex to calculate, and certainly nobody's going to present the exact calculation in a public domain but Ukraine has adopted effect-based planning long time ago. So there is a connection between the strategy and those actions. Those actions are not random. If at some point of time they might have seen random simply because Ukraine did not have a capabilities to do them in a sort of systemic manner. Right now, Ukraine has capability to do this in systemic manner. So we clearly see a campaign. That campaign has goals. That campaign has effects calculated, clearly related to the rest of the strategic operation which Ukraine is doing. So yeah, I mean, our command is clearly thinking about like why they do that, and they do answer questions. So what, when they see a new results of those strikes. But generally speaking, any military person can confirm you that, destroying enemy's logistics is the first thing you should think about, because that basically takes off the load from the front. And that's the key problem which Ukraine has to deal with, is overload of the first line, overload of the infantry, because most of our weapons, apart from those drones, are extremely short range. Artillery, and other methods, and including the smaller drones, they all operate in a distance of like tens of kilometers, so maybe 10, 20, 30, and so on, from the place where they launch. And of course, they don't launch exactly on the front line, so they have to be a bit behind. And that basically makes a massive overload of these tactical depths and the front and the first line and infantry which are sitting there. And allows Russia to use deeper areas for replenishing and supporting those troops. So damaging that logistics is a key task, and that's what it's all about.
Thank you very much. We've got two more questions for our panel, and then we will move to the Q&A. We've got a lot of interesting questions coming in, so keep them coming. So to our panelists, please keep your next answers brief. Ambassador Herbst, 4 weeks ago, Trump called Putin the obstacle to peace, and now Trump and Zelensky are exchanging what one could call insults. How does this end, and what will its impact be on eventual peace negotiations?
I think idiosyncrasies of presidential diplomacy under Trump are at play. We know that Trump does not take criticism easily. I've already explained how the Riyadh meeting was a tactical mistake, a serious tactical mistake by the Trump administration. Zelensky expressed concern publicly about the Riyadh meeting. This is what prompted Trump's first outburst this week. That intemperate outburst prompted some additional criticism, albeit not direct, of Trump from Zelensky. So Trump, as he often does, escalated. That's how this all came about. As I already mentioned, Trump has this peculiarity of thinking that flattery and soft words are the way to deal with dictators, with strong armies. And that's what led him to this kind of approach. And then the the brickbats being thrown between Trump and Zelensky came from the fact that Zelensky expressed some concern about that. Now, again, if Trump's intention is to listen to those advisors who do not hold major national security policy positions, who have no clue that Russia is dangerous to the United States and therefore would throw Ukraine to the dogs. If Trump's intention is to listen to them, then what we've seen happen over the past 7 days are the first signs of a serious American policy failure. But again, I think that Trump has given numerous indications that he wants to achieve a durable peace, despite the evidence to the contrary, which is there. And I think Trump understands that if he were to end American support to Ukraine, make Ukraine vulnerable to a Russian takeover, he would be seen as an exceptionally bad American foreign policy president who has been snookered by Mr. Putin. And I think Trump desperately wants to avoid that. That's why I think that the problems we've seen come from, again, those peculiarities of the Trump approach. And I think he's probably already beginning to contemplate how he needs to get back on track to where he was 4 weeks ago, if, in fact, he wants to get a durable peace done relatively quickly.
Thank you very much. And then, Minister Zakharnouk, we have a couple questions from the audience about this as well, but with my own question on the same topic, let's turn to the subject of elections in Ukraine. So regarding the constitutionally mandated moratorium on elections in wartime in Ukraine, there have been increasing calls from some, including President Trump, for Ukrainians to go to the polls. What is the status with Ukraine's elections, and how does it connect to the war and any diplomatic efforts? Just unmute.
Sorry, there is for sure that provision in the Constitution, but let's not hide behind the form of the law, because that as an argument only can work until a certain moment. And there's a lot of people who oppose that. They say, well, just change the Constitution. You can get together and change the law and so on and so on. There are much more real reasons why that cannot be done today. And these real reasons are, you can look in the history, that's exactly the same reasons why UK haven't done elections during the World War II. Because logistically, it's extremely difficult to do. A lot of people are fighting on the front, which is very difficult for them to vote. There's a lot of people who are currently left the country, and it will be tough to create the opportunity for them to vote. There's unsafe for people to vote because of the daily strikes. Let's not forget about that. It's easy to forget in DC or Brussels or London and so on, but in Ukraine daily there are like drones flying, ballistic missiles flying, etc. And people have to queue to the elections, and they have to stand for hours in these queues, and they cannot disperse and then come back, and then disperse and then come back. And also, finally, there's one more thing which people for some reason don't talk about much, but it's a fact that in Ukraine there is a distinction, as in any other democratic country, there is a distinction between military and political life. So there is a civilian control which prohibits military to be elected. Now, we have a huge part of active population who are currently serving, and they may be not considering themselves as professional military for the next years, but they're serving because the country needs them. These people cannot be elected because they're acting military, and they cannot campaign. And imagine like removing that rule, and then the colonels and generals will start to campaign for them in the elections. That's a disaster, because that's a huge breach of the civilian control over the armed forces, which is absolutely key principle. And in United States, this principle, and in United Kingdom, and this principle is absolutely maintained. You know, there is a very clear distinction between them acting military and their chances to participate in political elections, not as voters, but as the ones who could be elected. And in Ukraine, if we just exclude all the people, then the question would be, is that fair to people, and is that representative? if the best people of the country who are currently took arms and defending the country, they cannot even be considered for those positions. So all these things, I mean, clearly indicating that yes, elections have to take place because Ukraine is the democratic nation. It has to have elections after certain period of time. Clearly, it should be clearly stated. After the martial law is basically removed and the mobilization is over, so the people who can return back homes and restore lives and set up voting booths and be safe during those elections, as soon as that is possible physically, regardless of any laws, as soon as that physically possible, it's a time for the elections. Yes, but not before.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. We will now move to audience questions, and I'll ask the panel to keep their answers short. James, let's start with you. This is from Wes Lowe. Could you expand on the role Ukraine's European partners play, especially after the crisis meeting in Paris earlier this week? Is this a wake-up call for Europe?
May I make one comment on the question?
Yes.
You were supposed to ask me and didn't, about Putin's goals.
Yes.
It was there. And I want to say that Putin's goals were very clearly set out in the two draft treaties of December 2021, which amongst other things called for the return of all NATO forces beyond the lines before the first enlargement process, and the return of all US nuclear systems back to United States and US territorial waters, all of that. And at the time, those draft treaties were presented. They were presented as an ultimatum. Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said, they are a package, not a menu. Take it or leave it. The reaction in Europe was, they know perfectly well this is nonsense and we will never accept that. My comment at the time was, the Russians know this perfectly well. They don't expect you to accept it today. After Ukraine loses and after you lose, then you'll take it seriously, and this will be the basis for discussion. And therefore, I take seriously any indication, and there's been a lot, that the Trump administration and Russia have been talking about these issues behind everybody's backs. Now, the question about from was it Mr. or Mrs. Lowe? I don't remember.
Wes Lowe.
Yes, about Ukraine's partners. Could you just repeat it again, and I'll give you a 20-second answer.
Thank you for the other answer as well. Wes Lowe asks, could you expand on the role Ukraine's European partners play, especially after the crisis meeting in Paris earlier this week? Is this a wake-up call for Europe?
It's too late for a wake-up call. The question is, there are two questions. In the long term, what must we do? In the short term, what can we do? And there are different answers. Once you get to detail, there's seismic shift in thinking. There's understanding we have to reject the old paradigm is suddenly replaced by a number of very old lines of division and some new lines of division. I think what is essential now is that Ukraine's most committed partners sit down with their Ukrainian opposite numbers to try to agree what Europe can do to support Ukraine with the capabilities it currently has, if necessary, without the participation and backing of the United States. I think this is essential. This is not closing the door to cooperation with the United States, but it's starting from this very realistic bedrock. We have to have that discussion. Unfortunately, in Europe, there are still allies who latterly, by the way, which seem to include Poland, but I'm not certain of this yet, who refuse to have this kind of discussion in the absence of the United States, and who are still saying, as a matter of faith, without US backing, we can accomplish nothing. That is terrible news for Ukraine, and I don't think realistically it is so. Could I just remind everyone here that in 1970, the UK was devoting 5.4% of its GDP to defense. If you look at everything Europe was doing for itself, even before NATO and in the years shortly after, when its economy was shattered, you would be astonished, if those who have not lived through it, at the moral fiber that was displayed, the resources that were committed, the risks that Europeans were willing to take. There is no objective reason why, in conditions where the US economy is the virtual equal, where the EU economy is the virtual equal of the US economy, that Europe cannot rise to the level of our optimistic expectations. There are political and psychological reasons why we don't. And this is perhaps our last opportunity to face up to this and to overcome it. Sorry for a very long answer.
The good answer. All right, Minister Zaharnouk, we've got a question from, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, Anjung Cho at VOA. The question is, North Korean soldiers have been suffering high casualties. Almost 1/3 of 11,000 North Koreans deployed are killed or injured. What is your assessment of North Korean battlefield performance, weakness, and strengths?
Well, the weakness is very simple, and it's very clear. They have no experience yet. They have no good command and control structure, and Russians are using them as a cannon fodder. So basically, that would be the constant rate of their losses, if not higher, because they simply send them to die. Same way as they treat Russians, so it's not a big difference yet indicated. Maybe they would treat them differently, but we don't see that so far. So basically, that would continue. The thing is that for North Korea, it may not be a big problem because, of course, there is no transparency in the country itself. So they may be losing these soldiers, but it's not going to make any effect back home, except that they would gain the experience, and that experience could be then used against other countries and in other conflicts, and that is very serious because that's the first time North Korean soldiers actually and their officers, which may survive and come back home and tell lessons learned about the war in Ukraine. So that for sure would be taken into account. If I may, I just wanted to add about the elections. What I said is that the elections have to be done right after the martial law, but it's never clear when the martial law has to be lifted. And there is a push right now to say, let's do the ceasefire, let's do elections, and then let's do the final agreement about the peace and the specifically about the long-term security arrangements. That would be a very wrong construct because the security arrangements and very clear terms of the if ceasefire at all comes, which is still a question, has to be done at the same time and clearly before the Ukraine even thinks about demobilization. Because otherwise this may, first of all, never happen, and secondly, Russia may use this pause and use it to its own advantage. And we have seen this, not officially, but we have seen this a lot in the press, that such scenarios are being currently like cultivated somewhere. And just, we have to be very careful about that.
Thank you. James, another question for you. This is from Ira Strauss. Could Ukraine demand conditioning of any early Ukraine elections on internationally supervised free elections in Russia at the same time?
That chance of getting that linkage accepted, if they do, I think that what is needed, you see, we are dealing, amongst other problems, with an alarming level of ignorance on the part of many people who hold power and occupy senior political positions, not only in the United States, where it's most dramatic and most conspicuous, but in Europe. I think that what is needed instead is an explanation, concise and persuasive and direct, along the lines of Andres, as to why elections are not possible, and they would be deeply damaging to the cause of those who are urging Ukraine to hold elections. And after all, Andrei did not, I don't think he mentioned one telling fact, that a considerable majority of Ukrainians are opposed to holding elections during war, precisely for the reasons he mentioned.
Yep.
General Kellogg initially, I think his views have been corrected now, said that it was normal in the Second World War for democracies to hold elections. No, it wasn't. Elections were held in the United States for the simple reason US territory was not being attacked and it was not occupied. And in the UK, a lot of people think the UK held elections. Absolutely not. The last general election in the UK was in 1935. And the next one was after the war concluded, at the time of Potsdam. And you will remember in the middle of the Potsdam conference, Churchill left and Attlee arrived. And Eden left and Bevan arrived. So there is an alarming magnitude of ignorance, and I would say it is. I don't like saying this. It is very strongly concentrated in the Trump administration at this moment, when Trump comes up with totally imaginary and fantastic figures about how much aid Ukraine has received from the United States. What did he say at one point? 300 billion, then 500 billion. Does he know this, that he's making things up, or does he simply not know what the reality is? So whatever else goes on, I think that we have to do a far better job in communicating basic facts.
Thank you.
Right.
Ambassador Herbst, a question from Peter Carr. How do you view the medium-term relationship between Trump and Putin? If a deal is reached, what will happen next?
If a deal is reached and it's a deal that holds, I think that the Trump team is looking at a relatively fast normalization of relations with Russia. I don't say that with any satisfaction, because even if you achieved a stable peace, the Trump team is not talking about a just peace. A just peace would involve Russian forces getting out of all Ukrainian territory. So, and even if Putin were forced into a stable peace, we should assume his intentions would still remain troublesome. It's just he wouldn't have the power to act on them. So we would need to be vigilant. But the indications are what I've said. But there's actually one caveat here. I actually think that it will be very hard for Putin to accept the terms of a stable peace. You know, the conditions that Trump put down, or his team put down, of European peacekeepers and significant arms for Ukraine, the Russians have rejected. We might be in a position to force them to accept that if we're willing to apply very heavy-duty measures. But even then, we might be able to do that. We might be able to force them. Well, not certainly. So we may wind, if we pursued the right, strong policies, we might find ourselves in a stalemate because Putin would not agree to those things which could create a stable peace. But again, if somehow we achieve that peace, we would have to be wary, but I'm not certain that this team in the White House would be wary enough. But that's highly hypothetical.
Thank you. And speaking of this team, we have two perhaps contradictory questions. So question one from Russell Jefferson and Ambassador Herbst, I will give these both to you. General Kellogg seems to have withdrawn from the headlines renegotiations with Russia and Ukraine. Why is this so? Does he still play an important, if any, role as envoy? Question two, Keith Kellogg just tweeted about positive meetings with Ukraine and Zelensky, whom he praised. Is this part of 3D chess? From Anonymous.
I think that Kellogg remains an important part of the Trump team trying to end this war. Kathleen Leavitt, the White House spokeswoman, made this point a week ago when people questioned her about the statement by Trump regarding Witkoff, Rubio, and Waltz as leading the Russian side of the effort. I wouldn't be surprised to learn, but this is at this point hypothetical, that Russian objections to Kellogg is why he was not named as part of the team dealing directly with Russia. We know that Kellogg has been forthright on the dangers to American interests posed by Putin's foreign policy. The Russians noticed that too. But even with him not playing directly in the negotiations with Russia, he is an influential member of the team. I think he has helped create the right conditions to establish a stable peace. And I think that he still has access to the president.
Thank you very much. Minister Zaharnyuk, I will give you the last question as we keep getting questions about elections in Ukraine. So we will turn back to that. This is from Laurel Atkinson. She says, given that Zelensky won a landslide victory in his election based on the premise to end the years of war in the Donbass, do you realistically see that his mandate now to remain as president is void? I.e., should elections be held today, and would he be elected again? The media consistently shows Ukrainians just want this war to end.
Well, for sure, Ukrainians want this war to end. That's certainly. I mean, as any other normal people would. And certainly, we realize that Zelensky did everything possible to end the war on a normal terms with Putin, but the certain things just cannot happen. And certain things is like a two-way street. So essentially, you are in a situation when, unless you can end it by force, and that's not what he was promising, you simply cannot do this within the reality. I was actually in the office when Zelensky was trying to negotiate with Putin. That was 2019, and then there were negotiations for several years after that, until essentially 21, when it was clear that the Minsk format is not working. There's been many skeptical people about that, many realistic people, which were saying, come on, this is not going to happen. Russia wants to destroy Ukraine. You can't negotiate about that. But he tried. He tried to do this in 19. He was doing, he was maneuvering the forces. He was clearly trying to enforce the ceasefire, and so on and so on. So I can tell you that he was absolutely sincere when he was trying to stop it. But Putin was clearly thinking about destroying Ukraine. And so what you can do about that, really? Ukraine has elected president within the constitution, within the law. And in the law, it wasn't written that, oh, you have to do something specific. It wasn't clearly, you are elected president as with a condition of. So was he sincere? Yes. Did he actually try sincerely? Yes. Is he legitimate president today? Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would also like to recommend to our listeners a piece yesterday from the Atlantic Council's Peter Dickinson in our Ukraine Alert blog addressing this question of elections. Ambassador Herbst, James, any last short comments?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate our panelists' time. It's evening for all of you in Europe, and thank you for all your work. And to our audience, thank you for listening in.
Thank you.